Ja, och nu har turen kommit till vår hedersdoktor Ellen MacEachen. Och nu ska jag växla till engelska. Ellen MacEachen is honorary doctor of Faculty of Human Science. Ellen is a professor with the School of Public Health Science at the University of Waterloo. Her research examines the changed nature of work with a focus of health and labor relations. In her research, she considers the design and performance of work and health systems to identify how they can be improved and adapted to a fast-changing economic, social, and technological environment of our global economy. Professor MacEachen specializes in the qualitative research methods, and her research is informed by a critical sociological lens. Please welcome Professor MacEachen. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Now? Okay. So it's a great honor to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I've also had the pleasure of being at the university for the last 3 weeks and have had an excellent time. I had to think about how to tell this story. Everyone has a different story to tell. And I start my story with the very first Swede who I got to know, Åsa Schulin, who is now an associate professor here at Mid-Sweden University. At the time, 17 years ago, Åsa was a graduate student on a 3-year work disability prevention program in Canada. As I got to know Åsa and other Swedish people, I was impressed with the similarities between my country of Canada and Sweden. For instance, we have similar weather. We both have moose. We each follow hockey quite closely. But we also have our differences. And a key issue, for instance, is the social solidarity in Sweden as evident in the taxation system here, compared with the individualism that we have in North America. So appreciating social norms, expectations, and differences in ways of thinking in the field of work and health is at the heart of my career, which I'll now move to by talking about 3 key themes in my research career. I'll start with the first theme, which is methodology, which underlies everything for researchers. I'm wholly convinced that to tackle complex problems, we need diverse methods. It can be difficult for people to work across methods because we tend to speak different scientific languages, and we can have different ideas about very basic things like the nature of reality. But this sincere appreciation of differences has spurred me to take on leadership positions in the fields of occupational and public health, and to understand also how friendship and trust are needed to manage differences and to bridge these differences and for activities to move ahead. While I've always appreciated the stimulation of different types of methods and different types of scholars, I decided early in my research that I would become expert in one methodological approach, which is qualitative research methods. Although I was good with numbers, math was my best subject in school, and I was accepted into a very good epidemiology graduate program, I decided to go with qualitative research methods. At the time, qualitative research in the health sciences was an underdog approach, and it still is a little bit of an underdog in some fields. But I felt that this methodology answered the questions that I cared about the most. For instance, how does this work organization or social security system work in practice? What can we learn about the complex causal links between context and behavior? How do people in positions of control explain their logic? I also appreciated how qualitative research can be at the forefront of discoveries about the nature of social phenomena. While it's important to ask quantitative questions like how much and how many, qualitative research can teach us at the very early stages of understanding problems. So much of my teaching and my course development has been around qualitative methods. For a moment, I'd like to return to the issue of friendship and trust being needed to bridge differences, this time in relation to knowledge translation and exchange of research. A practice I adopted early in my career was to work with multiple stakeholders when I developed and ran research studies. These would be people like government policymakers, injured worker groups, lawyers, employment standards officials. It takes time and effort to build these relationships, but building relationships with a diverse group of key stakeholders in my field has helped me to understand what research questions matter and to whom, and how to position research results as they emerge. Using these approaches, my qualitative research studies have led to legal changes in Canada to better protect vulnerable workers, as well as organizational change in a key social security institution, again, protecting workers. So this brings me to my second theme, which is changing workplaces, the changing nature of work. We are living in the middle of a technological revolution that has dramatically changed how work is organized and carried out. Technological developments are obliterating whole fields of trained workers and creating new fields like digital platform work. For my postdoctoral studies, I studied managers in software firms, which was a growing field, and one that operated in a boom or bust economic environment. I wondered how managers could attend to workplace health when they were also worried about going out of business at the same time. This was a space where managers couldn't directly supervise workers like you could in a factory because they didn't know how to do what their workers did. So instead of directing processes, they focused on the final output, which is similar to how we work in academia. So in software firms, this left the programmers free to work at any time or place that they liked, as long as they got the job done. A key finding from that study is that the flexibility sounded great, but it had its downsides. It became apparent that what the flexibility did in that context was to ensure that the programmers were always able to work, whether they're at work or at home. It was one of the earlier studies to show how flexibility, instead of making work relaxing, could sometimes be a way of never getting away from work and managing tough deadlines and a very intense pace of work. Early in my career, I was invited to lead a study of injured worker support groups. The government funder wanted to know if their funds had been well spent and if they should continue spending their funds. What I learned in that project changed the course of my career. It opened my eyes to the vulnerabilities of precariously employed workers in the face of a work disability system that seemed to be built for a different type of people, for those who had resources or who could advocate for themselves. By precariously employed workers, I mean those workers who are low wage, who have short-term contracts. They're also workers who are set up by large companies as self-employed, like people who work for digital platforms. After recommending ongoing support for the injured worker self-support group, I moved on to examine precarious work in other studies to see how work is managed in these types of, see how health is managed in these types of workplaces. So for instance, one of my studies examined how temporary work agencies work in practice, where every worker has two bosses, the agency and the client employer. In the context of an increasingly polarized society in North America, where the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, I have examined how precariously employed workers were managing to access any of their rights to social protections when they became ill or injured as a result of work. And the answer is with difficulty. Colleagues and I are championing needed legal change in this respect. More recently, with the growth of the gig economy, I've become interested in the health and work life of digital platform workers, like Uber drivers, who the platform companies set up as self-employed. These digital platform companies, like Uber, claim that they're just companies who provide a convenient technology that people can use to buy and sell services. But at the same time, these companies dictate what these workers can charge, the pace of their work. These organizations can also fire workers by kicking them off the platform if they're not sufficiently productive. This gives these platform companies basically the same control that they would have over employees, but without any of the responsibilities that they would have for their care or protection. My research in this area has delineated how the growing area of platform work places pressures on workers, then induces them to take safety risks, and how the insecurity of this work breeds anxiety. Again, countering the discourse of freedom and flexibility that's prevalent around platform companies. My team has drawn attention to the supports needed by these workers, such as basic employment standards and minimum wages. And we've contributed to the ongoing discussion in my jurisdiction around digital platform work. Finally, I turn to my third theme, which is social security systems as they impact work and health. My studies have, for the most part, examined activation policies. The context here is a concern across many welfare states that they were creating a dependent and unaffordable population of people who were dependent on benefits. In the 1990s, this led to a widespread return to work for ill or injured workers. The work return would occur before the workers were fully recovered, but with accommodations. So many of my studies have examined this phenomenon of return to work, usually focusing on how it plays out with vulnerable populations, such as those with long or complex health problems or those who are in precarious employment. My research has raised important questions about policy implementation, especially in the context of government-organized incentive systems for employers. We have shown some of the unintended consequences of these incentive systems and how they need to change to achieve their stated aims. It's been satisfying to see my work helping to bring about system improvements for injured workers in my area, and how it's prompted other workers to focus on some of the same issues. A key issue is that it shows our values. The different types of welfare states that we live in reveal what we aim for as a society. This is the focus of a graduate international work and health course that was created 5 years ago between Mittuniversitetets University and my university at the University of Waterloo. Working with Mid-Sweden colleagues Åsa Schulin, Sten Wigberg, Jan Sellander, we have brought together Swedish and Canadian students every year for the last several years to explore these issues of values and social contracts in each of our countries by asking the question, what is fair? We've had a very productive time working together and are now planning more collaborations. And I have to say, in the last 3 weeks while I've been here, I've been so impressed with this department in this multidisciplinary group in the health sciences department here at Mittuniversitetets University that's uniquely brought together a group of work and health scholars that helps people to think across different disciplinary bridges. It's really quite special. So as I wrap up, I'd like to return to the theme of Canadian-Swedish similarities and differences to say how stimulating it has been to have had these working relationships between our two countries, even if Canada has lost some standing here in Sweden recently when our hockey team lost to the Danes. But I look forward to our future work and visits together. Thank you.
And now it's time for questions.
Thanks a lot for a very nice presentation. And I wonder, there are similarities, but also differences between Sweden and Canada, as you say, and we have this more comprehensive welfare system where everyone is covered. Would you think, two questions actually, would that be something for Canada to implement? And would you like to, and would it be possible?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Jan and I co-teach a module where we talk about those issues. And in Canada, we look to Sweden as the model. And the Scandinavian countries, we see a much more humane way of supporting workers than we have in Canada. And we've had conversations, because in Canada, people are held responsible more, right? Employers and workers. At the same time, you know, people sometimes just need a little bit of extra support. And in North America, we seem to attribute everything to personal motivation. And are you trying hard enough to get better? Whereas in this system, it's much more comprehensive, and you have rights and you have entitlements to different types of support. I think overall, this system is much better. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very interesting topic and also an interesting lecture. What I would like to know is when you talk to policymakers and you said you're working basically with qualitative methods, is that something that sometimes impedes your, let's say, effectiveness? Because we very often know that if policymakers approach us, they say, what are the numbers? Yeah. And if you have the numbers, whatever they are, and even if you make them up, that is very powerful. If you say, oh, I have very good qualitative work, then very often they believe they can do this themselves, and then they're not really believing your argument. It's something that you all have experienced?
Yeah, that's a great question, because often policymakers think about qualitative research as small sample size studies where people talk about how they feel, you know. and so that is perhaps my studies have been more effective because I've invited those policymakers into my integrated knowledge exchange and translation format. And so when the study is being formulated, I'm talking to them. What are some problems that you face? You know, what? And then they sit with us as we design the research. You know, how should we approach people? Who do we want for our sample? And when we have our emerging findings, the policymakers are brought together again. And not just the policymakers, we have diverse groups, and sometimes they're arguing across the table. But we say, these are some of the things that we're finding. What does this mean to you in your organization? And then nearer the end, we have, so how should we communicate these results? What's most important? And that's what's brought, for instance, with the legal change for the temporary work agencies, it was a Ministry of Labour stakeholder on the study, and he trusted the data. He had been with us all the way through. He knew we weren't just talking to people about feelings. We were looking at the complex organization of systems and the logic and the financial incentives and all sorts of things that he probably wouldn't have expected. So it is a bit of an uphill battle with qualitative research, but if you integrate people early on, it works very well. Yeah. And you talked in your own presentation about speaking with I really appreciated that. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Yes. Question of my own. One of the challenges with public health is the time. It takes a long time to get the results. And we talk about 15, 20 years ahead, right? So you don't know by then, was it this or that that made the change or not. And I usually say that you go to the politician and say, give me money instead of a bridge or something else where it's visible. And I will put this money in public health, and you get some results in 15 or 20 years ahead. Who put money in this company? So what's your recommendation to convince the politicians that public health is a good thing.
Yeah, well, I think everyone learned a lesson with COVID-19 around that. In my jurisdiction, we had a right-wing government come in, and they said, "Oh, we're spending too much money on this and that," and they cut public health budget, and there had been some, a lot of our people who work on minimum wage don't have any paid holidays, and there were 3 required paid holidays, and they cut that. And then here comes COVID, right? And there are no resources to manage it. Trying to hire people, trying to bring back the people who had all the experience who left. And then we have all these workers who maybe have a sore throat, think they have COVID, but they don't have any paid sick days, so they go into work and they're spreading it. And so, unfortunately, a terrible thing like COVID-19 taught us a lesson around public health. But the challenge with public health is that when things are going well, you don't see anything. Yeah. That's the big problem. It's invisible, and so politicians have a hard time with that.
I think the security is the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, thank you very much.